declare the meeting open. Inform, I'll just wait just in case anybody. Okay, I'd inform those in attendance that anyone in the public gallery can use mobile devices through the Wi-Fi connection, and all devices should be muted. Password details are available on the gallery rules for anyone wanting to connect to the Assembly's Wi-Fi connection. 3G and 4G should not be used, and no recordings or photographs are to be taken. Members are also asked to ensure their electronic devices are switched to mute mode to ensure quality of sound recording. I would also seek agreement from members that agenda item 6 is recorded by Hansard. And if members are content, we'll proceed through the agenda. So first of all, apologies. We have some apologies, I understand.
Yes, Chair. Apologies from Mr. Jim Allister, Mr. Jonathan Bell, and Mr. Paul Gervin has informed that he is going to be late. So.
Derek Hussey won't be here. He's not well.
Russell?
Sorry,
No, you work away, yes.
Cross-party cooperation here. So, sorry, he will be here later?
He won't be here.
He won't be here at all, okay. And we don't know, I think Katrina is going to join us. There's no indication that she's maybe just running late. Okay, members, I would refer you to the draft minutes on pages 5 to 9 of your main pack. Any members got any issues with any of the minutes? If not, and if it is agreed, we will publish those on the website. All agreed?
Great.
Yeah. Okay, matters arising. There's a summary of requests to the Department of Finance outlined on page 4 to 10 of the table pack. Any members, any queries about any of that? We do have still quite a bit of information outstanding with the department. I'm sure that will be.
Yeah, I mean, like none of it is life or death stuff, but it is, I suppose, just trying to get the ways of working that it does come in broadly on time, or if there's a problem with the timelines we give, flag that up.
Okay, well, we'll continue to pursue the responses as quickly as we can. Any other matters arising? Okay, so we'll move swiftly on then to the scrutiny of the budget response from the Department of Finance. I refer members to the clerk's brief on the matter at pages 12 to 38 of the briefing main pack. Revise Annex 2 to the clerk's brief on pages 12 to 13 of the tabled pack. So that's just a revised timetable, so there's some changes in that. So the first one is included for clarity, and then the second one with some small changes. Department of Finance budget response and comparative timetable, pages 39 to 42 of the main pack. And Department of Finance outcome of the June monitoring round and various issues at pages 43 to 98 of the main pack. Okay, do members have any questions, queries, comments on that information?
On the outline, yeah, I appreciate that this has been revised. I just don't really understand, and if I'm raising it at the wrong time, why the written statement needs to be as late as the 19th. I think we want to be building in as much opportunity for discussion and scrutiny as possible, and we appreciate that obviously there are immovables there in terms of the Chancellor's statement, but you know, it is a one-year budget. We could understand a little bit more if it was a 3 or 4 year budget being laid. And obviously, you know, the department are working away on this. We do anticipate there'll be additional finance from London coming, but surely all the baselines and so on are done. So, I mean, I don't know if I can propose it here, but I think 3 weeks would be sufficient, and to have the ministerial written statement as an oral statement on the 12th of December that would allow for Assembly discussion of it, and indeed committee discussion in the two in committees.
I suppose the question is, presumably the ministerial statement will outline at that stage some sort of early indications. There's Chancellor's autumn statement was on 23rd of November. So I'm assuming, and perhaps officials can help us with this in terms of questions later on, about what the internal process will be at that point. Presumably that will be their first indication, or sort of first time they'll have any sort of firm budget lines, etc. in front of them to work on. I'm not sure if they have a process of further consultation that they need to do around the outcome of that. Presumably it also has to go to the executive before the minister makes a statement. So I suppose it's whether or not that's from the 23rd to the 19th, that's about 3.5 weeks.
3.5 weeks. Well,
At the executive, we're going to have 4
23rd
weeks.
one. Well, we'll give them three weeks really, and on the proposal I make it. I suppose the point I make it is 23rd of November isn't day one. It's not that there's going to be no work done on this until we see the Chancellor's statement. Yes, we won't have firmed up budget lines, but as I said, we know all the baseline work is done. You know, they kind of broadly know we're aware now that the department knows everything at all times, so they know what the pressures are and all that kind of stuff. So it's adjustments that are made really to the planning on the 23rd. After the statement, I think 3 weeks should be at it. If it's not, I mean, if there are procedural reasons, then sure we can discuss them. But it allows. There's just in the dead of winter when no one's here. There's putting that statement out on the 19th just seems like a waste of time, and it seems to, as you know, we do have concerns about committees and the Assembly, more importantly, being bypassed, and this would be a way to address that.
I think the indication is that the last plenary is on the 6th of December.
We can have
But
an
that's
additional
one
sitting. I thought we were here on the 11th as well.
Yeah, one option may be to indicate that we'd be willing to come back.
Yes.
But perhaps it would be best to leave, maybe we can consider this at the end again after we hear from departmental officials about what they need to do.
Okay.
I am conscious that if it is the 6th, for example, you are leaving a very short window, and presumably there will be, regardless of what way you look at this, presumably there will be implications of both capital and revenue coming out. So even if what baselines and there's a provisional budget at that point, there will be a piece of work around what the impacts are on that. Where's other funding going to come from? Presumably there's a period of some form of consultation with other departments, officials and some stakeholders at that point, but we'll know further probably at the end of the... So perhaps if we leave that and we'll ask officials about what that process looks like. Of any other, there's some implications in relation to sort of the take note debate. I'm not sure, Jim, if Jim has highlighted some issues about that. It had been sort of more of a protocol previously, but the timescale is obviously very tight, and in terms of putting down a motion, you're almost having to react immediately to put that motion down, and you could end up with the schedule of that being very close to the actual debate on the budget, which I'm not sure would there be much value in. So, Jim, I'm not sure if you want to make some comment.
It had normally been the protocol whenever the draft budget came out for the committee to put down a take note debate motion. Now, previously the budget was subject to change after that, and the final draft budget would be led following that. But this year, obviously with things being different, and to have a take note debate on the 30th of January probably isn't going to add any value to the process. And what I've been suggesting, the alternative approach, it may be better for the committee to wait until this was all over and then evaluate the budget process and look at how the committee could get some agreement with the department moving forward. There's, as members will know, there's a draft memorandum of understanding in the ether at the minute. It's seeking agreement between the Assembly and the Executive, and maybe a motion relating to that might help that move on and get some agreement for the way the budget process would work for the multi-year budget afterwards.
Yeah, so it's there's clearly some issues that have arisen this time around because of the timing of the Chancellor's autumn statement, and there's some obviously associated issues in relation to a change of process, which we're still not going to get the opportunity to question officials on. I do think, though, that key to all of this is getting the right process in place for the multi-year budget going forward as well. So although we're having to firefight, as it were, with the timescales that we have, because of sort of the Treasury timings in this one-year budget coming up, I think there are serious issues in around actually how can we make sure that it's a much more ordered process for the multi-year budget, which will have much more significance for the Executive and the Programme for Government. Anybody, any other comments at this stage about? I will revisit the timetable after we have it here from officials. Philip?
Chair, it was just around the whole concept of legality and to get thoughts on that. I know there's pages of legal opinion from Mr. Sheldon in the pack. And the question around the consistency with Section 64 of the Northern Ireland Act and Para 20 of Dram 1 of the Belfast Agreement. And I think that the QC references the gunning principles in terms of effective consultation. I'm certainly no lawyer nor suggest that I am, but I would be interested to get some views and perspective. I know, Jim, in your note you referenced about potential legal opinion around this. And I know the Department have come back and basically said, you know, we didn't give you any time last year, so the President has said, so we're not going to give you any time this year. That doesn't, two wrongs don't necessarily make a right. So, you know, there really is no time for effective consultation on this. So basically the budget will be a fait accompli, and I personally don't think that's acceptable, but I'd be interested to know what the view is around the legal view around this here, because the papers do raise a number of issues. Whether they're valid or not is open for debate, but I'd be interested on a more learned perspective than mine.
Okay, I'm just going to make some jokes that I'm assuming then you want me to speak to them.
Absolutely, yes,
You're not going to charge us for this?
no bill.
Double job. No, I'm assuming you're talking about some legal advice in relation to these. No, I thought the paper was useful enough. I suppose the question is whether or not the sort of gunning principles are engaged at all, if there's no formal consultation. I think the interesting thing is, like you referenced about no effective consultation, I think what that QC paper does indicate is that actually the courts have looked at the matter and have indicated previously that, for example, even just 5 days, you can have effective consultation within that. And I think, you know, to me, the legal advice seemed to say, look, it depends on the issue. There's lots of variables involved in this. There's no black and white approach to these issues. I do think that regardless of the time frame, we do plan for the most effective consultation that we can have. I thought the information contained in the papers around the sort of the accounts previously, the baselines, I think that's useful information for us in terms of a snapshot of what last year's budget position is. I suppose the piece that we don't know is what the pressures are, and we've heard some indication from some of the ministers like health, etc., about where some of the pressures are within the health department, but because of the change process we don't have clarity as to where other pressures are. And I suppose it's a combination of what are pressures, what are inescapables, and what's ministerial priorities as well. I think you do find in departments perhaps that officials' pressures are not necessarily where the priorities would lie for the minister, and I think this new process is designed to work a little bit better with that. So yeah, we've had a response from the Department of Finance in relation to some of those matters. Members have an opportunity to consider their response, because we had written to them around, I think, about supply officers or information going to sort of that official to official engagement around pressures. Agreed. Are members content that we revisit that timescale then after we hear from the officials? I'm also conscious, and I know that we're coming up to the research papers. There's a number of really good research papers there. You know, some of them have arrived, you know, just in the last couple of days. So I'm also aware that perhaps members haven't had the opportunity necessarily to read through those, especially those in the tabled pack. But again, I think that could inform our discussion in due course around the wider aspects of whether a memorandum of understanding or what way the process is going to work, particularly for the multi-year budget. But there's no further comments on that at this stage? No? Okay, well, we will we'll hold then the recommendation on that until after, and we will move then on to the next item on the agenda, which is the Assembly Research Briefing. And I'd welcome Pamela Dugdale, Colin Pigeon and Michael Scholes from Research. Very welcome. Thank you. So there are, again, I'm conscious that perhaps members haven't had the opportunity to digest the more recent papers, but there are papers in your pack, pages 100 to 122 of the main pack, is the Assembly Research paper on forthcoming Executive Draft Budget 17-18, Assembly Consideration. There is a research briefing paper on the budget 17-18 at page 15 of your tabled papers. There is Assembly Research on Monitoring Round Scrutiny at pages 16 to 30 of your tabled papers, and a research paper on October monitoring round outcome on pages 31 to 38 of the tabled papers. Okay, I'd like to invite you to make a short opening statement or just to speak to your paper, if you so wish to do so.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to speak about the paper that was in the pack from Friday,
Okay.
just to sort of clarify which one's which.
So just remember it's pages, I think, 100 to 122 of the main
The
pack.
main pack.
Okay. This briefing paper is designed to support the committee's scrutiny role in respect of the 2017-18 draft budget. This is the third year that the Public Finance Scrutiny Unit has produced this type of paper to assist the Finance Committee in orientating the Assembly's scrutiny of the budget. As you're no doubt aware, and as you were discussing, this is particularly difficult for the 2017-18 year, as the budget consultation period is planned to take place prior to the Department of Finance. All of the departments receiving their funding allocations. The paper follows the following format. The first section relates to background information. This defines terminology and gives some some information on the central financial arrangements. Then section 2 covers recent developments in this area. Section 3, it's a strange term, but it's around the funding envelope. This is a term that the Department of Finance has been using recently to describe the funding allocation for Northern Ireland for the 2017-18 year that was provided at the 2015 spending round.
I'm not sure if it's a recent term, to be honest. I think I've heard it.
I don't think it's a recent term, but it is a term that has been
Which
used.
term? Sorry.
Funding
Funding envelope.
I've been using it down south for years.
It isn't a recent term, but it is one that's being used. So the real meat of the paper is in section 4, and it provides potential issues for the committee that they may wish to pursue, and it's broken down by budget area. Can I just point out at this time that the Finance Minister's announcements yesterday in the Assembly may have overtaken some of the information within the paper, which was produced last Friday. Now, all three of us are prepared now to take questions if you'd like.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think these are very useful. I do suspect some members will not have had the opportunity, or all members will not have had the opportunity necessarily to digest all of the information, particularly within the context of the total monitoring being yesterday and looking at the implications of that. But do any members have any questions in relation to those research papers at this stage? Yes, Philip.
Thanks, Chair. Well, thank you for the paper. There's a lot of good information in there. I suppose the question for me is looking forward to November and the Chancellor's statement on the potential impact on our budget here, and the two graphs that you produced on our pack is pages 113 related to both capital and revenue, and showing that whilst in cash terms things may be plateauing, in real terms, certainly from a revenue side, less so than capital, there is a downward trajectory in our funding. Have you any feel for the implications of that there, or how departments are taking that on board and planning for that over the next year? I know it's only a one-year budget, and that's another difficulty, but I'll come to maybe in a minute, but just on that point perhaps.
Well, in terms of the, and this is one of the difficulties that I think the Assembly faces, is that those graphs are representing what was announced in the Spending Review 2015, and we simply don't know what will come out of the autumn statement. There has been talk around the fiscal stimulus, probably capital. but the question is maybe how is that funded? And if it means deeper cuts into resource Del to provide more capital Del, you may have a different shape to those graphs. In advance of this reduction, obviously the civil service, well, in fact, the wider public sector has had the voluntary exit scheme, which I think has reduced the civil service by, I think I read earlier on, 17%. But that's certainly in terms of posts. So that was part of addressing a reducing resource situation, I think, in trying to reduce the pay bill. Not sure how far that goes to answering your question, but maybe a little way.
Thank you. I know it is a bit of crystal ball gazing to a degree. I mean, another issue is obviously the single year element of the budget and the implications around that. I know I was speaking to a primary school principal this morning, and one of the issues that they have is that year one, they're halfway through of a 3-year budget. They will hopefully find out relatively soon what year 2 holds, but year 3 is when most of them, most of the primary schools that I'm aware of will go into deficit, and obviously at this stage they have no idea as what that budget is going to hold. Have you had any feel at this stage as to what the process is likely to be for the medium term once we get past this 1-year hurdle?
Only that there is to be the executive plans to hold a multi-year process then afterwards for the following years after this year. But I suppose the issue will be there's only really, once 17-18 is done, then you've only got 18-19, 19-20 on the resource side was already set. Now, it would depend a little bit on what the Chancellor decides to do in the autumn statement. Maybe that period will extend, possibly, I don't know, and I would be speculating only, really. There is more certainty around the capital side because of the Executive's decision to categorise a certain number of programme or projects as flagship projects, so those have already been allocated in a way. So there's not really, I don't think there's anything going to change around those projects. It's just maybe a question of if there is more capital, then maybe more projects can be taken on. Yeah.
And finally, Chair, your paper you referenced the financial transactions capital. I know the Minister made some commentary to that yesterday, and I'd be interested in your, I suppose, more knowledgeable interpretation of that as to what you thought of the comments he made in relation to this.
Well, it would appear that from the Minister's announcements yesterday that financial transactions capital is still continuing to be a bit of a problem for the Executive. The Minister mentioned that he is confident that the UK Government will allow there to be the money to be carried forward and it won't be lost to the Executive. But actually, in one of the papers Colin's going to speak to in a moment or two, one of the questions is whether there are any contingency arrangements if that isn't provided, because 77.5 million unallocated at this point in the financial year is a lot for financial transactions capital, especially FTC, because of the financial or the private sector involvement that's required for it, because it takes a while for projects to come to fruition with it.
I think that was my concern, because civil service will tell you to spend 77 million in revenue at this stage would be near on impossible, but to do it on capital with the lead time is...
FTC is even more complicated than capital because of the private sector involvement. The projects have to be agreed through Treasury as well to make sure that the ONS, because the ONS have to certify that the body is private sector, so there is an awful lot more hoops to jump through for the Department of Finance, to be fair to them, and for the other departments before you can allocate the money, which is why a lot of times it's been used for co-ownership housing. At late notice, that's what it has been used in the past couple of years, for late allocations to use for so that it isn't lost.
So the Minister, I think he said he was going to try and get the Treasury to agree to roll it over, essentially.
Sorry if I could just cut in. He said what he said was a special dispensation on the use of FTC that will facilitate the creation of the planned investment fund. And then he said his request was positively received. So, I mean, one of the questions perhaps we thought was, well, what was the shape of that request? Exactly what was it that the Minister was asking? And then if the committee can establish that, you might get a bit more of a feel for whether or not that, well, one, whether or not the Treasury will accede to that request, and secondly, whether, you know, this money is going to be spent.
I had presumed from that, and we can't get clarity, is that he was looking at sort of almost like an end-year flexibility approach, where he could carry that forward in the absence of being able to spend it this year. Have any of the other regions across the UK have they had the same amount of difficulty in terms of FTC? Are we picking up? You know, anecdotally, you do hear a number of reasons why. You know, and out there that say, look, access to finance for the private sector is now much easier. That, you know, really the complexity of going through FTC compared to going to a bank or other establishment for the private sector means that they're more likely to go to the private sector, not to utilise this. Is it, you know, you hear a little bit perhaps about the use of the private sector in conjunction with government maybe being a less common thing here, with less of a record of that, and that's why it's a bit tougher for us. But are you picking that up from other regions, that there are issues with financial transaction capital, or is this something that's very much our problem?
Well, in his statement yesterday, the Finance Minister did say that the Finance Minister for Scotland and Wales had been in concert with him. They were all singing from the same hymn sheet, you know, to request easements or more flexibilities with the use of FTC.
I just wonder, I suppose there's a number of opportunities. I think I tried to question the Minister yesterday, but he didn't respond to my question on this, which is, in his monitoring paper, he seemed to be indicating that the department were doing quite a bit of work in terms of trying to encourage some ideas to come forward as well. But it had been difficult. You know, I think even the generation of the ideas to begin with from departments. So it's not even a case that there is a long list there, and, you know, or perhaps those on the list are not good ideas. I think even generating those in the first place has been quite difficult. So, you know, I was trying to say both on this area, but also actually on the public sector transformation fund, that, you know, is there anything that can be done specifically to bring about or generate or animate those ideas? So rather than just putting out a call and relying on individual departments with all of the other pressures and priorities that they have to come up with these, is there something that we could be doing perhaps as a committee? I'm just very consciously looking at this paper. Yes, there's a lot of unknowns about what the autumn statement is going to say. And to that end, we can try to speculate. We can also try to speculate about where the pressures are. But there are still some opportunities there, clearly even referenced in October monitoring, around the Public Sector Transformation Fund. I think there's, £100 million left unallocated of that. That probably provides a really good opportunity. We know that money's going to be there. We know it's ring-fenced for public sector transformation. Is that, how can that be used in a way that actually brings about the savings that adds to the pot in terms of the pressures elsewhere? But also perhaps to support agendas like the BAGOA report and response in terms of the health sector transformation that's required there. I just think there is an opportunity, but there doesn't seem to be ideas necessarily coming forward. So I just wondered, you know, that might be an opportunity for us as a committee to try to do a bit of work around that. What does that look like in other jurisdictions? But also then on the financial transactions capital, is there an opportunity, for example, for that to go into an investment fund? You know, is the investment fund as set up going to be deemed by Treasury to be sufficiently independent that it can, you know, transactions capital can be used? If it's not in the form that it is currently proposed, then is there some work that we can do to look at other investment fund type vehicles across the UK where it has been deemed by Treasury to be sufficiently independent to be able to get access to financial transactions capital? I'm assuming that's what they're trying to get at with the investment fund at this stage, but I suppose it's that lack of knowledge that we have about the other jurisdictions as to what they're doing. Have they some good ideas that we could be doing here?
Well, I do know that the Strategic Investment Board here has been promoting feverishly the financial transactions capital. I had looked at FTC a couple of years ago, but I haven't done. I've been keeping abreast of it, but I haven't done any further work. So if
It might be worth us maybe speaking to the Strategic Investment Board about the difficulties that they've faced and what other outreach work that they have done. I'm also conscious, like DFP do have, or Department of Finance have the Innovation Lab. So, you know, again, is that something they could be looking at, you know, what the options are around the use of this money, because it is there and it is additional to our block grants, regardless of what the autumn statement's going to say. This is money that is available. Jerry, you wanted to?
Well, thanks, Chair. Well, I'm just trying to get my head around this whole idea of the Minister's new way of getting the pressures, identifying the pressures, rather than have bids. I'm just wondering, is there a formal approach to that? You know, or is this just an ad hoc arrangement? You know, where does it happen? Does it happen in Assembly corridors here somewhere, or is there meetings to discuss what the pressures are?
That's, through the chair, it would be something that the officials may be able to shed more light on later on. I mean, the department's monitoring guidance that was issued at the start of the financial year had a form for bids. Then when the system changed, it was reissued in July. I think it was July without the bids. That's one of the things, unfortunately, we've been come up against really, and the Assembly is obviously trying to deal with, is how do you get to grips with where those pressures are. There was certainly some talk around it in this committee. Was it last week or the week before? Mr. Alistair had proposed getting the supply officers in, and I know the head of supply is coming in later on, so perhaps that you'll get more information then. But I don't get the sense that it's a particularly formal process, and it's the formality of the previous process was perhaps one of the reasons why it's no longer there, because it had become, I don't know if it had become overly mechanistic or something, or I don't know.
And is everybody aware on the committee about the previous process? Because I'm aware of some new members who perhaps wouldn't have scrutinised the previous process. But, you know, it just even from my own personal experience of working with it, but it was very much, you know, the sort of the accounting officers within departments would have, through all of their officials, identified all of the pressures, collated all that information together. But there was it seemed to me to be a lot of official-to-official engagement through supply officers, etc., with the Department of Finance prior to it getting to a ministerial stage of looking at. So, you know, ministers then would be presented with, you know, here's the 20 different areas within your department, and here are the pressures under each of them, and that's what we've been talking to the Department of Finance about. I suppose where that process didn't necessarily have, where it lacked perhaps was that the minister may be looking at that and saying, well, I'm happy enough that those pressures aren't met, but here's a priority issue that I want money identified for, I want that moved around. John, from your, and Katrina, from your experience in the departments, and Jim, I'm not sure if you have any kind of observations about the previous process.
Just what you've outlined there. I think people are becoming too fixated on process rather than on delivery. And the sense of yesterday we've seen investment in services across the board, which is more important to citizens rather than how that decision was reached and who had a say and who didn't.
Chair, I think just as you've explained that was my understanding. I don't think anybody's suggesting that that process couldn't be reformed and that it wasn't clunky, and you're absolutely right. There's a difference between what the supply officers might think are the pressures and the ministers, and of course it is with the ministers, and I don't think anybody's suggesting that we couldn't refine that, but the fact is that information is available within the departments, and nobody's saying that we should, you know, scrap all looking at the detail and only look at the process. But I don't think anybody apart from the government parties understands why some of that information can't be public. If there seems to be a lot of delivery, why can't we get the detail of that? And interrogate's the wrong word, but I don't think it has been adequately explained whether or not the bids process is gone, because I mean, even in the statement yesterday it referred to the fact that the bids process didn't exist, and then Overleaf a few paragraphs later, it referred to the process before your bid was made. So it's the fact that narrative is happening within the departments. Something is going through to the minister. We're not suggesting that we get chapter and verse. That's obviously for the government to keep to themselves if they want. But some of it should be allowed to be released, and there's no good reason why it isn't.
Yeah, so I think that, so my understanding of the process though is that that was against what would have been projected. So priorities may change in year, etc., etc. So the information that committees may have got about what the pressures are is very much an official's view of what the pressures are within the department, i.e. if we continue with this particular line. Whereas I think that what then happens is that at a ministerial level, and ultimately everything within the department does happen through the minister may be saying, well, actually, these are my 2 or 3 priorities, and having that negotiation at a minister-to-minister level. People will always want more, I suppose, is the issue. So it's whether or not, in terms of the ask, should everybody know what the ask is as opposed to what people get. But my sense from what the minister has said thus far is that, you know, rather than to have the very bureaucratic process, which actually shows officials identifying just administratively where there may be pressure in the system, is having a better conversation around what the big priority issues are, and not how that's reflected then in terms of in your monitoring, etc. But there's almost like it's that sort of full and frank exchange within the executive. I think that's where the, you know, how does that interface now with the committee? So I think Katrina had to indicate.
Yeah, I mean, just following on from what both yourself and John said, I think it's delivery and making sure budgets are spent, and early identification of when there's any concern that budgets won't be spent, so it can be worked through other departments that badly need it. And so it's what you're saying there about discussion amongst ministers, real discussion amongst ministers about how we ensure delivery right across the board. And then in terms of the capital budget, I mean, I think one of the things that's been a real success here is capital budgets have been spent, whereas in the past money was being sent back because there wasn't proper delivery. So the more discussion there can be across your health and education and justice and communities, real discussion and real negotiation.
And I suppose the question for me really is that, and I'm not sure if research would have the answer to this, is there's clearly a lot of what I suppose could be termed as committed expenditure, even rolling into next year. So the contracts of the teachers and the nurses and the doctors and the buildings and everything else. And that committed expenditure presumably takes up a huge amount of the budget. I'm presuming it's at least 95% plus of the budget, which is already tied down in terms of wages and inescapables. So I suppose what we're really talking about in any budget is, well, actually, where's the discretionary, where's the non-restricted funds, and how should that be spent? And I suppose one of the things that we could do, and one of the things we could encourage other committees to do, is actually to have that, like, what's the priorities that they have, how much is that going to cost, are they going to make that proposal that should be taken into account? Because by the time you take into account what needs to be paid for, you're talking about probably a small amount of money, and then it comes down to what's the government, you know, what's the priorities, and how is that reflected, and who's delivering that. Do you have a sense about how much of the budget could be described as inescapable? Or
I think, Chair, that's what we were getting at on page 15 of the paper that was in your main pack. There's a list of questions in the blue box, section 4.1. And that's really what we're trying to get at, because I don't know how good a sense the committees across the Assembly have of how much of each minister's budget is contractually committed. Because if 99% of it is committed, then you're expending an awful lot of effort for that 1%. But on the other hand, if there's more scope for a real discussion between committees and ministers and departments over where the priorities might lie, then obviously there's greater scope for input. So that's what we were trying to get at with that series of questions there, was to try and really get that baseline established. What do ministers actually have to play with, if you like? And then once you know that, then the committee could then start to say, okay, well, here are 3 things that we think are really important, whether it's there was money for nurture units yesterday, you know, other things like that. Is it early years intervention? Is it particular cancer drugs? Is it, you know, What are those things?
My sense is that that's where there's an opportunity for the likes of ourselves, because in other committees, if they go through that process, like they are, if you look at the budget, our October monitoring yesterday, there's perhaps £4 million for drugs, £13 million for the schools estate. But we're sitting here as a committee with a department that we already have funds there, but it's what actually happens with them. So instead of sort of coming up with an idea and saying, well, like, this is going to cost 15 million, and lobbying the minister to make provision for that in the budget, we have effectively £100 million sitting there in public sector transformation fund. You have the millions of pounds sitting there in financial transactions capital. We know that's going to be available. I think the other opportunity actually as well is around those additional funds that had been negotiated through the various agreements. And we saw that with the paramilitary report about how to get access to that. There'll be issues around the legacy and getting access to that, but also around Together Building a United Community and the drawdown of those funds. There was some discussion about that around shared education, etc. yesterday. But we know that these funds exist and they are additional and they will not be impacted by the autumn statement. And I suppose there are big questions for me, I think, even listening to the statement yesterday about how effectively we're working that to the benefit of Northern Ireland. And what can we do as a committee, I suppose, to ensure other committees are thinking about this, but also that we're helping the process of getting ideas coming forward around how to maximise the opportunities. But Claire, did you have something
Well,
else?
no, I think that's very good, but I think that you're right, and that's something useful, very useful. This committee could be doing, but I don't get the sense, and I haven't looked, in detail at the packs of all the committees. I just don't get the sense that committees even are getting that information, and surely that discussion around the pressures and around what is available and what's already committed should be part of each committee's judicious review of their departments. And I get the impression from other members, and even outside of the opposition government scenario that we're in, committees are supposed to be semi-independent of their own parties. You're as members of government parties are supposed to have the opportunities to do that. And
although that said, I don't think this is where there's a difficulty with that. I think this is where there's a difficulty with our argument, is that this is the way it works in Scotland, is the way it works in Wales, it is the way it works.
Well, I don't
in
think it is.
Westminster,
I think that,
or a variation of it. They certainly, like my understanding. But again, let's
I don't
get
think
some
the Scottish
information
committees are
about
delighted
that.
about it either.
I know,
to be
but
honest.
let's get some information about what way do they work, how do they operate. I think in a way all change is difficult, and to change away from that system there's always going to be an element of resistance to that. But ultimately, I think it doesn't make us. I don't think it makes us without a role. I think there's a very constructive role that we can play, regardless of whether or not we're going to interrogate the particular ins and outs of an official's pressures paper.
Well, I suppose that would be interesting to know what role do people see committees having if it's not scrutinising departmental spending anymore? What?
Well, I think it's scrutinising in a different way, and I think that's what the Scottish do, and that's what the Welsh do, and that's what Westminster committees do. And I think that this is the point where, because we may not get access to the as I said, the officials' pressures document that informed the process, which those other committees didn't get access to, ultimately they can still do the scrutiny role. They can still come up with ideas, and I think we need to look across that to say, well, actually, what's the most effective way of doing that?
Yeah, I suppose it's a political question, not a process question. What is wrong with transparency? Why can't that pressures information be made available?
Well, I think this is a call, and again, this is something I think we question the Minister on when he comes along, because it's obviously been a discussion with the Executive around a different way of doing business. I suspect it relates to the fact that this is something that is put together by officials within the department and doesn't reflect the Minister. But that ultimately we should ask a question of the Minister, and hopefully we will get answers around that. John?
Well, I think it's not even as much as what the pressure is as to who makes decisions around what pressures are. And what we've seen now is a collective response from the Executive as to what the pressures are in relation to various departments and where the Executive is prepared to put funding into. But I think it would be also interesting to note, over the years in which committees were scrutinising, allegedly, the monitoring rounds, which committee brought forward an alternative proposal to the Minister or a paper to the Minister to say, no, Minister, we actually think you shouldn't fund those pressures. Here are the pressures you should fund. I'm not criticising the former Education Committee, but I do not recall on any occasion the committee which was monitoring my work bringing forward an alternative proposal during monitoring round. So it may be good imagery that the committees and certain members of the committees are demanding access to pressures, demanding to know what the pressures are, etc., etc. But for what purpose? What are you going to do with
What
that
are we here for?
information?
Do we, do,
No,
do
but
we all,
let me
we
finish
lost
my
the
point.
election, do we just go home and come back in 5 years?
Let me finish my point. There is nothing to stop this committee or any other committee scrutinising the budgets of departments. You know what the department spends are. You know what the departments spend their money on and what services they have to provide. You can go through that list and decide where, as a committee or as individuals, you believe the department should divert funds to. There's nothing to stop a committee doing that. Some of the information is already in our packs in relation to what each department is funded. And I'm sure each scrutiny committee receives that information as available information. There is nothing to stop any committee coming forward with an alternative budget.
Well, and then on to your colleagues in Dublin, who clearly, like us, would like to see more information coming from the departments.
But, you know, there's the information, what you do with the information, what the purpose of the information is. If you wish to write an alternative budget, which we do in Dublin, the information is therefore available. If you wish to even look at during the spending rounds and where the prices are coming
Available a lot earlier in Dublin. They're not getting 10 days with it or whatever we're getting.
But we haven't decided what day it is. We haven't come to that proposal yet. And Dublin hasn't to deal with Brexit.
And they
But
also have a budgetary office that is there to provide. The opposition is resourced in that, and
Yes, correct,
they have a department that interrogates those figures and runs them through. So they have a lot of resources that, in a million years, I don't see this government providing.
We'll bring proposals forward. What I'm saying is that to put out this idea that the opposition parties in this case do not know what the budgets contain is false.
After
know
the
what the
fact, we
budget
don't know now. We have no idea. We don't know now. You know, you're bringing it forward at the very last minute and having some tinkering around the edge of scrutiny. But I'm just saying, match up your position.
It's an interesting discussion about the existential futility of the opposition and what they may be feeling at the minute. But I do think
democracy.
actually,
It's
I
not
do
just a
think,
one
Claire,
in 5 year
I do
event.
think that, and where I do disagree with you is that I don't think that it is a futile, you know, why are we all here? I think if you look at other committees, they can do a very effective scrutiny role with the information that they have, and that information is not a lot different from what we're getting at the minute. Again, we've referenced the fact that this budget process is different from what we hope that the multi-year budget process is going to be. And I think it has to be different because for a multi-year budget, we will want to do that role. We want to be coming forward with those ideas. And I think we will endeavour to try to get a process in place, which is a transparent process, which gives everybody that opportunity. This year's process, though, is particularly tricky because of the timing of the Treasury Statement. And that is an entirely separate issue to whether or not we get an official's paper about in-year pressures internally within departments. And actually, within the pack, there's a huge amount of information there from that DFP report, the Department of Finance report looking at sort of the analysis of the 2015-16 budgets and pressures. The borrowings and everything else. I think that's a very useful paper which could lay the groundwork for us being able to project forward. One of the big things I think we could look at would be, given the inescapables, and I know that both John, Katrina and Jim would be very aware of this pressure within departments, is about the inflationary increases and the potential impact on that. So even in terms of a flatline position, you know, that kind of inflationary increase can have a very significant pressure within both health and education in particular. So do we have a sense about that at this stage?
Can I just interrupt? The questions, and I think they pertain to what you were talking about there, about the committed figures for all the rest of the committees, and inflation and pay inflation and everything else. On page 15 that Colin had mentioned earlier, this paper is being shared with the other committees, so this information can be sought, you know, from each of the departments and then brought back together for use by this committee or for the other committees themselves.
And I am assuming, Claire, for example, in the Health Committee, presumably they're going to call somebody who deals with, for example, staff costs and asking about inflation. So we will get some indications about where those pressures are projected forward. Yeah, Jerry?
Chair, I'm just mulching over the idea that John has put out there, that from his experience that the Education Committee has been basically useless.
No, didn't say that. And I was very, no, excuse me. I was very careful in the terminology I used. I did not use the term useless or even hint that the Education Committee was useless.
Kind of phrase, but it basically was summarising what...
No, you weren't summarising.
In all your time in that committee, there never had been one proposal made to you as to how the budget should be spent. I think that's quite clear.
What I actually said, and it's been answered, is that during the monitoring rounds, the committee never come forward with a counter proposal.
Yeah. Could I say from my brief period is that the committee would never, if they were looking more money spent, they would never give you the alternative that should be cut in order to produce that extra expenditure. It always was more, and nobody had the courage to say, well, I think you should cut that service or that funding stream and give it to the Ulster or the Galvin or whatever. And that was a wee bit frustrating because everyone knew that we had a basic envelope.
Yeah, I understand that, you know, but at the same time, even if it hadn't been used for any positive benefit, that at least in terms of openness and transparency, people had the entitlement to it, to the information. We're being, from what I gather, as a new member of this committee, that I would like to have the information to let me decide if I have ideas or not.
And I do think that the executive has decided, because it isn't an entitlement, the executive has decided that should be an internal discussion with the minister, and the minister then produces what his priorities are. The minister then has a negotiation across the executive, and there's no doubt in the previous, and I think John touched on this as well, in the previous executive, individual ministers will have come forward and said, like, these are my priorities and I need money for this. I think there is an attempt here for the executive collectively to say, regardless of what ministry you're in, that actually if health is a priority here, then health should get that funding. So it's not just about the individual pressures within your particular department. And I think that, clearly what the indications are from the finance minister is the change of this process is to try to encourage that more sort of collective assessment of pressures across government as opposed to individual departmental pressures. But again, this is something that we can question, and I think we should question the finance minister on. We had written to the finance minister because he had promised to come along, because he didn't get to that part of the session previously. Have we had any response yet?
No response to that yet, Chair.
But I think it would be useful just to question him about his process as well. Okay, any other comments or questions at this point?
Could I just ask one question? The Health Minister yesterday made an extraordinary statement, and she said that if expenditure in health doesn't change soon, that in 10 years' time will occupy 70% of the executive budget. Have you seen any trends in your research to indicate where that statement's coming from?
90% of it?
90%, yeah.
The only thing that I have done was I had looked at under the old system, under the old departmental structure, the proportion of the executive's total DEL that was allocated to the Health and Social Services Department as it was, and it was. I mean, it was an upward trend, but that was based on what had been allocated to health, not what health needed. And I'm not sure if that was a question about. I didn't hear what the minister had said, but I'm not sure whether the minister was.
Well, I've absolutely no doubt if the minister was allocated 90% of the executive budget, she could spend it and spend it well. So that isn't the question about need, but I think the implication was that would be the demand just to stay still, would be 90% of the entire budget in 10 years.
I think it was based, Jim, on, I think what it was based on was a disaggregation of the pressure. So even on a flatline position, what the health department was requiring what in and around, you know this better than me, but I think it was about 6% per year to stand still. So I think what they've done is they've taken that 6% and, projected that forward. So that means that if you were to have a 6% pressure, which was met from that budget, in a standing still situation, that would mean that health would reach at some point the 90%
it hasn't had that level of increase. It's always been below the level that the department has said is required in order to stand
just
still.
All of the pressure kept growing to that extent of the pressure year on year, 6%, 6%. And if you project that forward in terms of the baseline budget being increased by 6%, but the funding envelope standing still, then it would reach that percentage.
Is it something that this can look at? And I know there was a paper which I have not read, but maybe some month of Sundays will about reviewing the processes, because this is the other thing, particularly if we're only ever getting this strung together estimates and resolutions and all that kind of stuff. You can't, and any proposal that you make is going to be met with who you're robbing it off. So some form of zero-based information being put in front of us, because that's the only way that you can really set out alternatives. So is
It is in
that-
the
is that
paper,
right?
yeah. So if you look at the finance paper, let's see, we're just.
We had raised, Chair, if I may, one of the things that we had suggested that committees should ask is what activities or services could actually be stopped if it was deemed to not be a priority, because the difficulty is, from my perspective, having tried to work with committees to support them, is that you don't know which lines of expenditure the executive has which are required in order to deliver a statutory function. For example, whether it's road lighting, testing, or various requirements of health and safety legislation or whatever. So in order to be able to make a counter proposal and say that such an area should be a lesser priority, you need to know whether or not it can actually be reduced, and it's really getting that information which would be helpful.
I think on page 63 of your pack, there's the public income and expenditure account, which is up to the 31st of March 2015, which is a Department of Finance publication. But I think actually that sets out the information very clearly around the total amount that comes in from, sort of turn to page 78, I think it is, of it. Exactly how much is coming in, showing you last year figures as well in terms of receipts from the UK government, the regional and district rates received, the interest, and then the expenditure, and it goes through that detail. I think actually it's a really useful piece of work in terms of demonstrating where the baselines are. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're right. Although it's different, and I think you're right, it is useful, but I think it's different to what Colin's outlining, which is that's the income, but it's I think they're two different.
Oh no, expenditures in it as well. So
But in
turn to
fairness,
page
if
80.
10 years after the Assembly has been formed, if committees haven't been asking what is a statutory function and what isn't a statutory function, then it does call into question what role the committees have been carrying out.
Well, what's your answer? I don't know. You tell me.
What committees other than this one do you sit on?
I don't, not at the moment, none.
Right.
But it's not just about doing what you and I want to do, it's about
No.
processes, and this isn't just me getting
But
over the top of it.
Just let me finish my point. I would find it hard to believe that, for instance, the Health Committee doesn't know what the statutory functions of the Department of Health are.
I'm sure it does know what the
Right,
statutory
okay, so you know what the statutory functions are. You then have put your costings against those statutory functions, and then everything else is up for grabs. The question is, have you the political will, or as Jim put it, the political courage to cut something to pay for something else?
I'm sure we do. I'm sure.
Okay, well, there's the equation.
You're the one who's telling me that in the last 10 years, none of your colleagues had any ideas about any of the departments they weren't managing.
No. See, there's something wrong with your hearing aids, because you and your SDLP colleague here aren't listening to what I'm saying and are deliberately misinterpreting it. What I've said to you is the committees in this Assembly can ask those questions, and I would be very surprised if they didn't ask the questions. And I use the example of the Department of Health Scrutiny Committee, as I'm sure knows what the statutory regulations and responsibilities are for the Department of Health. You have that figure, then you decide everything else what you want to change.
But what I'm hearing, and maybe I will have to readjust my hearing aid, is that if these ideas aren't coming through, then stop putting the information out there.
No, what I'm saying is this claim that you have no information and you don't.
We have less
Let me stop or interrupt me. This claim that there's no information and that committees cannot do their job is a false claim. It's how you use the information at hand to do your job. And committees have been doing very good scrutiny roles in relation to much of this stuff and bringing forward policy proposals, etc., etc. It's, are you prepared to make a decision?
Nobody is saying that there's no information. We're saying that there is a limit on the information the live information is being reduced, and what you're talking about is more of a budget base, and maybe when we eventually move to the 3 or 4 year, that work will be done when that information is available. But in terms of the topical stuff and the moving priorities, that's what we're being forbidden to access at the moment. And I just haven't heard a good reason, other than now your reasoning is you don't know what to do with it anyway. I haven't heard a good reason for not making that information available to the committees, not even just to the public, to the committees.
Just to, and members should continue to address each other through the chair. But I would also highlight that, as we've previously mentioned, the Finance Minister is there to justify the decisions about this. Members around this committee we haven't been privy to those discussions, we haven't been privy to that executive agreement, and ultimately the Finance Minister has to explain the reasons why, and presumably there are reasons there. We try to speculate about some of those reasons, and I think, to be fair to John on this, John's indication about ideas coming forward was in relation to, monitoring round information about pressures and people saying, don't go down that pressure and go down the other pressure. I'm sure that it has been the case, as Jim has outlined, that committees go, look, this is a really good idea, can you find 2 million for it, or can you find 5 million? But not necessarily saying, and we think it should come from a certain other source. I do, though, think that at the end of all of this, what I'm saying is that I agree with John, there is good work that we can do around scrutiny, around recommendations, around obtaining some of this information without seeing October monitoring pressures. Ideally, you may want them, but I think not having them doesn't in any way make our role here futile. So I just think it is about looking at the opportunities, asking the Minister the reasons why he's not giving us that information. But there's a ton, we're sitting, like looking at the papers that have been supplied just for this meeting, there's a ton of information there to digest. That document alone gives you all of the budget lines, what the baselines are, what they were the year before. And, taking a look at the statutory responsibilities, committee should be asking members to say, well, look, what's your staff pressures? What's the inescapables within your department? Where's your discretionary spend? And I think they will do that.
Of course, but the live rolling and political things that happen between budgets being set shouldn't be withheld. I don't disagree with any of that, that we should be looking at all of that, but it doesn't mean that the information should switch off then once those budgets are set.
Okay, well, I think that's been a useful discussion. I think there's plenty of stuff to pick up on and move forward in terms of some of the detail. I think it would be useful if members do take the opportunity to read through those papers. And I understand members got these relatively late, but I think it would be useful for members to read through that. Let's pick up sort of what issues of interest there is, and we can follow on this discussion next meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so just moving on then to correspondence. I'm going to ask the clerk to brief members on.
It's not the same page.
So,
We've got do we have the department?
yeah, that
Oh yes, we have.
so outcome of October monitoring round, oral evidence from the Department of Finance. Again, I'd remind members that this session is being recorded by Hansard. Therefore, all electronic devices, with the exception of the committee tablets,
Say adjust your hearing aid.
tablet devices must be set to airplane mode and on silent or turned off while the committee is in session, as they otherwise interfere with transmission recording proceedings. I refer members to yesterday's statement, which is contained in your pack. I'm sure everybody has read it anyway, pages 40 to 57 of the table of papers. And I want to welcome the following witnesses. Ms Joanne McBurney, who is the Head of Central Expenditure Division, Ms Emer Morelli, who is the Head of Supply, Public Expenditure Directorate, and Mr Stephen Barrett, Central Expenditure Division. So we've just had a rather lengthy discussion about some of the processes and new systems that are in place, and I know members will have a number of questions for you in and around all of that, but I would like to invite you first to make a short opening statement, if you so wish.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to update the committee on the outcome of the 16-17 October monitoring round. The Executive entered this round with an overcommitment of 13.5 million on resource DEL and 11.4 million in capital DEL. As set out in the Minister's statement, there were a number of centrally held items that impacted upon the level of resources available. When taken along with the 20 million set aside for renewable heat incentive, this left the Executive overcommitted by 30.1 million on resource DEL and 4.3 million in capital DEL. Departments declared reduced requirements of 11.6 million resource DEL and 16.2 million capital DEL in this round, which brought the overcommitment on resource DEL to 18.5 million and left 11.9 million of capital DEL available for allocation. As detailed in the Minister's statement, the Executive has made allocations of 8.9 million in resource DEL, which related to a number of prior commitments, and 22.7 million in capital DEL. The Minister also set out details of his first step stimulus package totalling 30 million this year. As a result of this, the Executive has concluded the October monitoring round with an overcommitment of 27.4 million on resource DEL and 10.8 million in capital DEL. Following the October monitoring round, 4.1 million of ring-fence resource DEL remains unallocated. This can only be used for non-cash depreciation and impairments. As detailed in the Minister's statement, it is now unlikely that the planned investment fund will be established prior to 31st of March 2017. As a consequence, the £55.8 million ring-fence financial transactions capital set aside in the budget for this purpose will not now be required in this year. Along with the amount unallocated following June monitoring and a reduced requirement surrendered in this round, this means that the Executive will leave October monitoring round with £77.5 million of ring-fence financial transactions capital unallocated. It is anticipated that the Executive will undertake one further monitoring round this year, which should take place in January. I'm happy to take any questions that members may have.
Thank you very much for that. I know that members will have a number of questions just around the process, but I just wanted to ask you, first of all, just some specific questions about the issues that I think were raised yesterday as well. In relation to the financial transactions capital, is the Department confident at this stage that you will find an investment fund model which will meet the requirements of sufficient independence, and has that been done elsewhere in the UK for financial transactions capital?
I'm not aware of it having been done elsewhere specifically for financial transactions capital, but we are confident we will find a suitable model. We've actually two options on the table at the minute, one of which has been sent to the Office of National Statistics to get their view on the likely classification of that, so we are hopeful that there will be a successful outcome. It's just taking a bit longer than expected because of the withdrawal of the EIB.
Okay, and in relation to the likes of, and we mentioned before sort of the idea of sort of a Scottish Futures type model, which you know that the Executive had looked at previously. Are you aware of if that is able to draw down from the Scottish Government financial transactions capital? Or are you aware of the details of?
I'm not aware of the details of that. As far as I can recall, I think Scottish Futures is classified as being public sector, which would mean it wouldn't be eligible for financial transactions capital, although they can possibly make use of it if they then transferred the funding onwards to private sector bodies.
Okay. And I'd asked the Minister, just in particular in relation to the Public Sector Transformation Fund, he made reference in a statement about officials taking actions to try to identify within departments some ideas of presumably sort of an invest to save type initiatives around public sector transformation, but that there had been some difficulties in identifying good projects or initiatives to take forward, and there's about 100 million that's unallocated in relation to that. I asked the Minister yesterday just about, you know, has he taken any specific actions to try to encourage or to animate ideas coming forward around this, as opposed to the Department simply asking departments perhaps to animate or generate those ideas? But I don't know if I've got a particular answer to that yet.
It's not really strictly speaking my area. The ESRD are looking at that, but yes, they are engaging with departments. I think they are coming up with ideas for taking that forward, and there's work ongoing on that. But as I say, public sector.
The Minister has raised the issue directly with ministers, other ministers, as part of his bilateral engagement. He is very keen that while departments and the NICS has taken the largest share of the VES to date, that the arm's length bodies and other bodies are now considered, and there's an active engagement through that process to encourage uptake of the scheme.
And is there sufficient flexibility? Because obviously the first phase of this was around the VES scheme, and the money was set aside, sort of ring-fenced as additional money for that. In terms of the burn, will there be sufficient flexibility to look at other alternatives as well? So in terms of running a number of projects alongside the likes of the VES, the second phase?
The flexibility for using the capital to fund this is specifically for voluntary exit schemes. It's not for other projects. That's not to say other projects couldn't be funded through other means, but not from the flexibility around the borrowing.
Okay. Philip Smith.
Thank you, Chair. Hello. I want to ask a couple of questions with regard to requests, and I'm not going to go into the whys and wherefores because I know that's not your decision. But if I can take health, for example, looking at some figures we've had from RAISE show that there was a 4.4% increase in the Department of Health budget on baseline. There was no change from the June monitoring, and obviously we no longer have bids, so we no longer know what requests there were. But I'm sure there are conversations with supply in terms of and discussions about where pressures are and where they're not. And I know health have dispensation where other departments have to transfer budgets internally within DEL if they need to. But are there discussions that take place between supply officers and the departments, and are those discussions minuted in a way of recording either asks or the conversations that essentially exist between the Department of Finance and other departments?
The supply role has been long established. Each department has a dedicated supply officer. They meet on a monthly basis through a regular stocktake process, which is monitored or minuted. And that stocktake process does look at key strategic issues facing that department, business case approvals, other issues that are emerging, technical issues. And we do touch on the pressures, steps that have been taken to mitigate those pressures and other actions. And that is an ongoing process. It's an iterative engagement that we have. We are now in a position where supply officers now engage collectively to review the pressures across those various departments to give an overall position at executive block level.
And we take that a little bit further, because obviously I'll take health, because health obviously is half the budget, and maybe soon to be 90% of the budget, but 50% at the moment, the guts off. And obviously we had the publication of the strategy yesterday. I mean, it seems a bit odd to me that health were one of the departments that didn't get any visible benefit from the monitoring round in terms of its resource DEL. And I suppose because bids are no longer disclosed or discussed, and because it's an internal process, it leads me to assume that there were no significant pressures disclosed by health, or no requests from health in the conversations between them and their supply officer, or otherwise. I'm assuming, based on the media that's taken place in recent days, that monies would have been provided, particularly for waiting lists, which are undoubtedly an ongoing pressure. So, is that a fair assumption?
Sorry, if I can jump in there. This monitoring round was slightly different. We didn't actually ask departments to identify resource DEL pressures in this round, because there simply wasn't the funding available at block level in order to meet those. There was a small amount of allocations handed out. Those were for commitments that had been given between the June round and the October round. So all we did was honour those previous commitments. There were no additional resource DEL allocations made, nor did we ask departments to identify pressures, because the funding available simply wouldn't permit us to make allocations.
And that then wouldn't be discussed at executive level either, in terms of those of the monitoring round, which I'm assuming the finance minister had to bring to executive for discussions. There's no opportunity there for departments to come forward with their thoughts.
There would always be the opportunity for other ministers to raise their concerns, and if they felt there was compelling pressures, no doubt they would have done so at the executive. The executive was also aware of the overall block position and the approach that had been taken, and not formally registering any resource DEL pressures.
Okay. I mean, in terms of, and you mentioned in your opening remarks around the overcommitment, 27 million on resource DEL and roughly 11 on capital DEL, which I suppose in the big picture is relatively small. In terms of outturn, then, you're content that there's no major issues going forward to end of March?
Yeah, given the level of departmental underspends in previous years, we're content that that level of overcommitment is more than manageable at this stage in the year.
Okay, thank you. One of the, I suppose, projects or main points that the minister made in the monitoring round was around this idea of a first step stimulus. And obviously the two main elements of that were 15 million for roads and 10 million for buses. I mean, it's referred to as a first step stimulus. Has there been any analysis or assessment done on what that will actually stimulate from an economic perspective in terms of that 30 million pounds?
Well, firstly, the allocations were determined. All departments were asked to put forward proposals for projects that could be funded from capital DEL, specifically from borrowing. These were the proposals that came forward. I think that sort of the benefits twofold, both to our infrastructure, both in roads and public transport infrastructure, and the creating jobs in the
And roads, I know from the old monitoring round process was always the one that benefited because it was relatively easy to get rid of money quickly. And no doubt that's again why it's got the lion's share. The buses, is there I'm conscious of the timeline in terms for expending that amount of capital? Is that going to fall within the next 5 months?
The Department for Infrastructure assures us that they can spend the money before the end of the financial year.
They have a contract in place, presumably. Obviously, the name of this First Step stimulus, I take it it is a first step. The Minister alluded to presumably a second step or a third step or whatever. Are there any plans at this stage, or is that awaiting the outcome of the Chancellor's statement in November?
Well, I think there are plans to take that forward as part of the budget process, and obviously the Chancellor's autumn statement will feed into that in terms of the level of resources available. Okay,
and the Chair mentioned the financial transactions capital. I had some questions around that there, but the 77.5 million, which obviously the Treasury, the Minister said the Treasury appears to be willing to give special dispensation because of the inability to spend before year end. Is there any thought at this stage as to the type of project that is to be used for? Are there any plans at this stage? It's a lot of money to be sitting there, I suppose, pregnant without allocation.
I suppose that the hope is that if it's carried forward next year, it does go into the investment fund once that's established. I mean, we're still working towards establishing an investment fund, and it would be hoped maybe that be up and running before the end of the next financial year.
Yes.
Or depending on ONS coming back on. So I think the hope is that it does go for the purpose intended.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned yourself the renewable heat incentive, and obviously it was mentioned that there was £20 million to be included to cover that. There's always a little difficulty around that budget. What the Minister didn't say, or certainly I couldn't see in the monitoring package, is what budget line was that 20 million coming out of?
At the moment, that is being held centrally, and it will be allocated out in January monitoring, pending the work that the Economy Minister's taken forward on that. So it's being held centrally, so you won't see it sitting in a department, it's being held. But it's important that we include it in the overall level of overcommitment to ensure that we're portraying the correct position.
Now, somewhere I think I read that the overall RHI impact was 30 million. Yeah, I know the Minister mentioned today or yesterday that was it yesterday? I'm running out of time. Monday was it? Anyway, that the Department of the Economy was going to absorb a portion. So presumably that 10 million is being absorbed through easements within the Minister's department, the Minister of the Economy.
In the October monitoring round, the Department for Economy reallocated internally 5.6 million, and basically that's the case of the proposed reductions and reallocations are them reducing sort of non-priority areas in order to fund pressures in other areas. So 5.6 million they have moved in order to do that in the October monitoring round.
Okay. And finally, I'd be glad to hear, Chair, there was relatively small budget-wise, but I know it made a bit of an impact from a media perspective. The issue around the action plan to address paramilitary activity, and the Minister said that a portion of that budget was unable to be spent because of a detailed action plan not yet in place. Do we know when that detailed plan will be in place, and if not, and the money won't be used by year end, what will happen?
Well, bringing forward the detailed action plan is a matter for the Department for Justice, and I'm afraid I can't say much more about that at this stage. However, the agreement for the additional 25 million towards the paramilitary activity in the Fresh Start Agreement was not for 5 million per year, it was 25 million over 5 years. So once all the detailed action plans in place and the agreements are there, then we will look at the profiles of that spend, so there's no risk of that being lost, simply because it's not spent this year.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Well, Philip's covered almost literally everything in that statement. Got it done yesterday and a lot quicker. But just I kind of understood it a little bit better there when you put it that, and that makes sense. Departments were invited not to bring forward bids because there was no money, nobody was getting anything. So I kind of, but I still don't have my head around whether the bids process is gone or is that a temporary cessation of bids because there's no money to be got. And as I mentioned in the previous session that you weren't here, the statement does talk about how bids don't exist, and then the next page it talks about best practice before bringing. So is it your understanding that when we when maybe there's more, there will be more money available hopefully in January, does it exist again?
No, bids do not exist anymore. We identify the pressures through the engagement with supply. The reference following that, I will hold my hands up, was sloppy drafting on our behalf. It referred to internal reallocations. They happen every round, and we just hadn't simply updated them previously.
What's the difference between a bid and a pressure, really?
Well, a bid would be the formal registering of a pressure, and what we tended to find was when we had the bidding process is departments put forward a huge wish list of everything they could possibly ask for. They really understood that there was little, if not no chance of that being met, but they felt they had to register. Basically everything that everybody had asked them to register came on the list. What happens now, and Emer can say more about this, is that they actually discuss with their supply officer what the strategic pressures are.
So basically, a pressure or a strategic pressure is a kind of a reformed and refined bid?
In a way, it's the department identifying where they have a real pressure.
And that's what will happen in January if there's more. It won't say bring forward your bids, it'll say bring forward your strategic pressures.
We won't so much ask to bring forward, it'll be through the engagement.
Yeah, I suppose we have an ongoing engagement with all our departments, and it allows for the scrutiny, the challenge. It's applied at an earlier stage when pressures emerge. We seek what actions are you taking. Is it a real pressure? Is it for the executive collectively to examine? Is it for a minister? And we are working through that iterative process to build up the picture throughout the year, and then in the formal points where the executive takes the decision, we bring forward that position. So it's an up-to-date, scrutinised position at that point in time.
Scrutinised, but where is that available? Is that available anywhere?
It would be provided to our minister, in our advice to our minister, and in the executive paper. There wouldn't be a list prepared, it would just be in our
So it's
advice.
scrutinised just within the executive?
Yes.
But nowhere else? Or is it available?
No,
Does it come out? And I don't know enough about it. Does it come out of the system at any other point after? No.
It wouldn't be available. It would be scrutinised by the executive.
It would be available but to the executive, but not the rest of the.
They won't get a list. It'll be in the overall advice provided to the executive, and then obviously each minister would be aware of the pressures in his own areas, so it can be the discussion around the table.
Yeah. Okay. Just the 5 million community regeneration. But is that under the executive office, or who's looking after that? Who's going to be managing that?
Well, the allocations will come in the January monitoring round. Our minister will have a series of engagements with other ministers and seek suitable projects.
And is there any guidance available on that, on what projects will be eligible, or who can access that money, or the maximum available, or any of that?
There's no specific guidance on it, because I think each project will be considered on a case-by-case basis. Our minister will engage with other ministers, and if they want to bring forward what they see as worthwhile projects. It's capital funding that has been set aside. At the moment, we're intending to fund it from the borrowing not utilised by the voluntary exit scheme. So we would be looking for projects that are suitable for borrowing. But I wouldn't say at this stage it rules out other projects. Every project that is identified, we will consider.
So that's only really accessible to projects identified by ministers?
Yes, no doubt. Doubtless that will be engagement, and other people will make representations to their ministers and projects they think are worthwhile. But it's not sort of an open bidding process.
Okay, Jim?
Philip has this uncanny nerve of seeing into my head and asking my questions, so I've learned a lesson getting ahead of him. In the middle of all this, there is one little nugget, the 4.8 million resource deal for Translarna. That is absolutely marvellous news for the young boys who have this awful condition, and will save lives. So it does show this assembly, when it can be fleet of foot and get money for very deserving cause.
I didn't.
Oh, you recording me?
No, I think you activated the Siri on my phone there. Issued a subliminal command.
I want to go back just one very small point to the Chair's questioning on the 77.7 million. Now, just to make absolutely clear about this, you're absolutely confident that you have got tied down an agreement to carry this forward to next year, or do you think you have?
It was mentioned, raised with the Chief Secretary on Monday when we had a meeting with the Scottish and Welsh Finance Ministers and our own Minister. When it was raised there, he did agree to increased levels of carry forward under the Budget Exchange Scheme. The actual details of the carry forward for the Northern Ireland Investment Fund we have to take up with the Treasury officials, but we're hopeful that that will be.
But there's no chance that other amounts, a budget will be set, amounts will be carried forward which may not include that 77 million?
We need to hammer out the detail with the Treasury officials, but we were getting positive indications and we'd be confident at this point.
So it would be very embarrassing to the department if we were to lose £77 million, or find we couldn't spend it before the end of the financial year.
I agree entirely on that. I mean, the circumstances that gave rise to this is because the way we were going forward was with the European Investment Bank taking a key role in this. Because of the EU referendum, they've actually said that they will not do that anymore, so it is linked to the EU referendum, and I think for that reason alone the Treasury will be.
Well, I presume it'll be mentioned in future, the next monitoring round. We'll keep an eye on this.
Oh yeah, we will keep an eye on
That's
it, yes,
okay.
definitely.
Thanks.
Just to clarify in relation to that, so I know there was sort of like suggested it was a preferred option around the European Investment Bank, but they hadn't actually agreed to do anything at that point to not agree it. Is that not the case? It was something that was an option that you
It was
were
an option,
keen to pursue, but it was just at that stage, no?
It still was, yes, at option stage.
But it was the preferred option, and it was the route we were going down.
The preferred option of the Minister? Preferred option of the Department?
Well, from the options available to allow the fund to be managed in the way that the Executive agreed that it should be managed, it was the preferred option.
Okay, John?
Well, just maybe in terms of the financial transactions capital, that's a Westminster driven relation, isn't it?
It is, yes.
So the Chancellor could stand up on the 23rd and change that whole dynamic of that profile if he's...
He was so minded to do so, yes, he did.
Okay, but just thinking out loud as much as anything. In relation to the Public Transformation Fund, and following on from the Chair's question in relation to how it could be used to alleviate pressures in the health service, it was used imaginatively before in relation to education, to reprofiling the workforce within education. A similar project could possibly be brought forward, I'm not suggesting it will be, but could be possibly brought forward for help.
Yeah, certainly, yes, any proposals will be considered on their merit, yes, there's no reason why not.
So, just because we had a brief conversation last week at the committee about trying to use that fund in a more imaginative way, a more targeted way, rather than simply allowing civil servants or public sector workers to come forward and bid if they want to go. But there is other ways of using it within that framework.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Jared?
Thanks, Chair. First of all, can I say to John, Philip can't see into your head, John, but he can see into your computer. But can I ask you maybe in terms of the new budgetary process? To me, there appears to be two trains of thought. One from the government side that it's a more effective use of official time, and perhaps the opposition parties would see it as the government trying to make the budgetary process a closed shop. And what do you consider? Is it effectively a good use of officials' time, considering the fact that we don't have any sight of a draft budget and very little time to see the full budget? You know, do you think it's effective government, and do you think it impacts on the credibility of this committee in any way?
Well, I don't really think that's for me to comment on. Decisions are taken by ministers and not by officials. However, I would say that supply engagement with departments does give a good representation of where the pressures are, and it does reflect the strategic pressures across the block as opposed to just wish lists from departments.
Yeah, I think as Jim or Philip, I did ask about in terms of the process, and you did give some indication of the formalities involved. So can I just maybe delve a slightly bit deeper into that? And can you give us a better outline of how the process works? Is it done on a regular basis? Is there regular meetings at a regular time in a certain place? Is there, and I think you did say there are minutes made and taken. And who are they made available to? Who has sight of those minutes? Just general information on that.
The supply process hasn't changed. The supply process has always been regular stocktake engagement with departments, usually through the finance director of the department. That process has always been there to look at issues that are affecting departments, what needs to be considered by the centre, what other steps are being taken, what are the big capital business cases coming forward, etc. And there is a routine minute kept of that for the record. That informs a supply view. It doesn't, the minutes aren't shared any wider than supply. They're the supply view that allows us to reach a collective view of the pressures are affecting all the departments in their totality. You know, that is just one element that we look at when we're considering the recommendations through then to the Minister.
Okay. Well, could I move on then maybe to the voluntary exit scheme? Can you give us some idea as to maybe the numbers of staff who have taken up that opportunity, and what savings it has made and how it will impact on the monetary rates?
Do you have some figures?
Yes, some numbers in relation to the impact of the voluntary exit scheme in 2015-16. In terms of the civil service scheme, the cost last year was 90.4 million, and that will deliver annual savings of 86.9 million. In terms of the wider schemes outside of the core civil service, the cost of the scheme in last year was 80.3 million, and that will deliver annual savings of 67.6 million.
Okay.
In terms of the number of staff left, it was 4,300 left last year.
Just talking generally then, moving forward to the more substantive budget process, have you, and I'm presuming that you have, started the work in terms of where you believe the projected pressures are likely to be? So first of all, and I know this is a speculative question, but are you getting any murmurs out of Treasury at this point about what is likely to be in the autumn statement around the balance between capital and revenue in particular?
We're not getting any sort of firm feedback on that. They have sort of indicated that we shouldn't expect any additional resource DEL. They haven't said anything about whether there'll be any reductions in resource DEL. We are hopeful for additional capital allocations, but there's no certainty, and they haven't really said anything to lead us in that direction.
And on the capital side, are you anticipating that it will be a one-year capital in the autumn statement, or do you anticipate that there may be some opportunity for them to make a longer-term comment about that?
They haven't given us any indications on that. I would imagine it will be a longer term comment, but I honestly couldn't stand over that. That's just my own feelings on that.
In relation then to, I suppose, pressures across the system and preparing, we've just been talking before you came in, you know, clearly there's a significant amount of money within the Northern Ireland budget which is, I suppose, inescapable for, you know, it's already contractually committed. Do you have an assessment at this stage about what kind of percentage that is of the budget, and how is that impacted by potential inflationary increases, particularly around health and education, for example?
That's part of the work that's ongoing at the moment between supply and departments. We're hoping to conclude that within the next few weeks to give us an idea, but at this point in time, no, we don't.
We wouldn't be in our final position.
Have you got a figure in terms of inflationary increase that you're working with at this point, moving forward into the next budget period?
We're basically leaving it to departments to identify where their pressures are falling, as opposed to us applying a percentage. We tend to look at whatever Treasury publishes as their GDP deflators as an indication of what the inflationary increase is, but different things will increase at different rates, so we're leaving to departments to identify where their pressures are falling.
I know there was some discussion just around the format of this. I think Claire had raised some issues earlier on around the ministerial statement and just about the process of what would be required between the autumn statement, and there are indications that we've got from yourselves is that there would be a written statement in around the 19th of December.
I don't think it has been settled yet. There will be a written statement. The sort of process will be shortly after the Chancellor's autumn statement, the Secretary of State will write to the Minister setting out our control tools, so our resource DEL, our capital DEL, etc. Then under the Fresh Start Agreement, there was legislation passed, which means that our Minister has to make a statement to the Assembly setting out what those control tools are, and that it has to be done 2 weeks before we lay a budget. So that will happen shortly after the autumn statement.
Sorry, is that just at least 2 weeks before you lay?
At least 2 weeks before, yes. So it can be as soon as possible, but given the time scales.
Which one is that? That he has to make a statement 2 weeks after the...
No, at least 2 weeks before he introduces a budget.
But it has to make a statement to the Assembly?
Yes, setting out the control tools.
And is that the 19th of December reference?
No. What we're then hoping to do is that statement will be made as a matter of course. It will be quite factual. It will be, here's what our control tools are.
Presumably within a number of days from the NIO.
We would be seeking to bring that forward as quickly as possible. Once the NIO have written to us, we'd do that as soon as possible.
So that's not in this, but so that would be approximately then the 7th of December or thereabouts.
Or if I can find my timetable.
Maybe even earlier.
2 weeks, I suppose.
Really is reaction. I presume that is really his reaction to the autumn statement.
Yeah.
And what are the implications for Northern
There
Ireland?
will be a
Yeah.
statement then, and
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah,
right.
that's the one sort of the penultimate one, statement to the Assembly on overall budget envelope early December.
Okay.
So that's, that statement will be made. And then, sort of working in tandem with that, following the autumn statement, obviously we will be working up proposals for our Minister to take to the Executive, and then we are hopeful that he will be in a position to present an agreed budget to the Assembly before Christmas.
So that process entails you get the when the autumn statement happens, you draft up presumably what our response, or you try to liaise with what the implications are, what the consequences are. You get the letter from the Secretary of State that informs the ministerial statement. Likely to be an oral statement, do you think?
It could be either. I suppose it just depends on, the availability and getting time slots. It could be either a written or an oral.
And then on the back of that, then presumably you look at your sort of draft plans at that point to see what the impacts are around the revenue and capital. Do you speak then to your supply officers then within the other departments? And does the executive at this stage have sort of proposals around when they're going to meet to discuss this, or is a series of negotiations between ministers?
There will be both. There will be engagement with supply, there will be discussions between ministers, there will be engagement, all of which will come in as presenting a draft executive paper for the executive to consider.
Yeah. As Minister, are you aware at the moment, is the Minister, for example, minded that he's a series of bilaterals, etc., with particular ministers around pressures?
So he's commenced that process already.
So he's currently having bilaterals around what their pressures are likely to be, and that'll inform then. Okay, and I think there have been some issues that have just raised here around could that statement be made, the written statement of the 19th of December, at an earlier stage. Now, we accept that there has to be those discussions and plans finalised and the plans, I suppose, agreed by the executive, but is that an option that you can go away and take a look at to say that even a week earlier facilitate, I suppose, increased scrutiny by committees?
We will be aiming to get it as soon as we possibly can. Obviously, the precise timescale is a matter for the executive, not for ourselves. It will depend on when we get executive agreement. That we will be working straight after audit statement to get everything finalised as quickly as we can. Now, what I would say at this stage is our intention is between the date of the budget being introduced in the Assembly, we are planning to leave as long as we possibly can between that and the Assembly debate and vote to allow for that scrutiny.
And in terms of consultation, is it the case that I suppose the formal position of the department is that there will be no formal consultation, but there will be a series of consultation meetings, or are you going to refer to that period as a consultation period?
We won't have a formal consultation period that we would normally have had we had a time for a draft budget and a revised budget. We will go out and we will be going out soon to make offers to sort of stakeholders that we will come out and talk to them about the budget position and where we think things are. That engagement will go on probably in November time. The Minister will then make a statement to the Assembly, hopefully before Christmas and as early as possible, on the budget. And if anyone wants to engage with us between that time and the time of the Assembly debate and voting, that we'll make ourselves available to talk to them on that, but we won't actually go out for a formal consultation on it.
And are you minded that the process at this stage is that, for example, the supply officers within health or education, that they're liaising with their committee, and that consultation with those sectoral stakeholders takes place within that context, as opposed to you centrally? Because there is a list of stakeholders that have been outlined in the papers, but, clearly there are huge gaps there in terms of the particular sectoral interests. So are you not intending to talk to those, but rather rely on the supply officers and those respective committee?
We wouldn't rely on the supply officers, we'd rely on departments themselves, because obviously we don't know who departments' key stakeholders are, so it would be for a matter for departments themselves to ensure that they engage fully with their stakeholders.
And their respective committees.
And their respective committees.
And they'll be feeding that through supply officers to you, but also to their Minister to inform then the executive consideration or the paper that goes forward.
So it's
Okay.
important to stress the supply officers sit in DOF.
Yeah.
And we liaise outwards to departments.
All right, yes. So, yeah, they're actually your
There
supply
are,
officers,
there
yeah.
are people, but we would expect departments, if they were getting anything, a particular message coming through their discussions with their stakeholders, that they would feed it back.
And just then in terms of the process, so you've indicated you haven't referred to this document at any point as a draft budget, and I suppose it had caused, some confusion in relation to sort of the duties under Section 64 of the Northern Ireland Act around sort of the draft budget being agreed and then consultation or scrutiny with the committees prior to the final budget. Was that a a decision that you'd made not to refer to that. I suppose what we're concerned about is that there is a period for our scrutiny and consultation. It's a very limited period. Unfortunately, we of course would want more, but we do want to maximise that time. Now, with the timescale that's set down there, it looks like the only real opportunity will be either to feed in prior to that budget being set down, and that if there are then amendments that are accepted by the executive, then that would be done by way of amendment to the bill.
Yeah, I think that the terminology draft budget possibly means a different thing to us than it means in the legislation. I would say the legislation, the view is that it is a draft budget until such times as the Assembly approves it. And I think that's the way the legislation is. We tend to talk about a draft budget as us producing one document, having a period of consultation, and then producing a revised document, which is then the subject of the vote. So I think when we're referring to the one-stage budget or just a budget, we're referring to, we'll not be producing two documents. But the budget itself will be a draft budget until such times as the Assembly approves it.
And have you taken specific legal advice around that section 64? There was some reference in your papers that you had, but that would satisfy the draft budget reference within that?
We have, and we have taken that advice, and we're satisfied that as long as we allow a period of scrutiny between the budget being introduced in the Assembly and before the Assembly votes on it, that allows for the appropriate scrutiny.
And is the Minister minded, so for example, if we scrutinise and we put forward some recommendations, is the Minister minded that those amendments then take place as a form of executive amendments to the bill after it's been laid down? Or is he anticipating that there will be amendment between the first line of this and final?
I don't think we would go into a process anticipating that there will be amendments, but the Assembly is free to make those amendments, and if they are appropriate, then I would imagine the Minister would be open to considering them.
I think it would be useful for us perhaps to see just the detail of that process to make sure that that we are also satisfied that there's opportunity for us. No committee will want to do work which is ultimately futile. So we want to make sure that if we are conducting that scrutiny and there's a strong intention to do that there is a mechanism for that being fed in. There is the time available to make those amendments. And I know that sort of on the back of looking at this week's events in relation to October monitoring and the Bengoa report and the Minister for Health's Vision 10-year document, that there was an executive meeting, I think, prior to the Assembly sitting just this week to take a look at that. And I think we would want to be assured, I suppose there's the opportunity where the executive is going to meet before it's actually finally agreed by the Assembly, and our views can be taken into account in that.
We would need to come back on that. I don't think the intention was that the executive would meet again to consider amendments. I think the intention would be that the budget is introduced into the Assembly by the Minister, and then there is the Assembly debate and vote. We allow a period of time, as long as we can, between the two, to allow for the scrutiny, and then any amendments be proposed formally, as opposed to the executive meeting again and producing a revised
So
budget.
amendments would be proposed by the individual members or committees, or in the process of that it wouldn't go to the executive. The executive considers our recommendations and then they decide whether to integrate those within the budget.
That certainly isn't the intention at this point in time. I mean, we can raise that and discuss that with our Minister, but that wouldn't be the intention at this time, because we will, although we're saying we'll allow as long as possible to do that, we are still constrained by the need to provide departments with certainty over their budget allocations, and departments have indicated to us that they need that certainty by the end of January. So the time available will still be constrained.
Okay, I do want to go on just very briefly and just talk about the upcoming multi-year budget process just at this early stage, but I know Jerry had indicated that he wanted, and I think Claire also wants in, just presumably on the back of that. Jerry, did you?
Yeah, I just wanted, what came to me, the Minister did say in his statement that he was going to allocate £15 million for maintenance and £10 million for new buses. Could you maybe give us a flavour of how you think that's going to stimulate the economy, and how would it be measured actually? Because to me, people who are going to work, whether they drive or whether they go by bus, go to work anyway, and maybe that money could be better spent on these bigger projects.
Well, I think there's two issues here. Yes, it will improve our infrastructure, both our roads and our public transport. It also creates jobs, in the construction industry or in the bus building industry. In terms of it could be better spent in other areas, there's no doubt that there are major capital projects. However, they would not be able to spend the money in this financial year, and it is only available and it needs to be spent before the end of March. So that restricts the other possibility of spending the money at this point in time.
Okay, Claire.
I just want to pick up on the conversation we just had about the timetable. Did we, and I'm just looking, and I'm sure they might even have a different debate, but I'm just looking at Scotland, who obviously have the autumn statement to deal with and Brexit as well. They're actually laying their draft budget on the 15th of December, and still the opposition are saying that they're not getting enough information and that they're to get high-level scenario information, and the minister there has agreed to publish that in the 3 intervening weeks. So it does. I'm not saying that they're exactly the same, processes and resources and context and stuff. But
do they have an end date on that? When are they?
That's what I was going to. I'm not sure exactly what the context is, but and they might. Although you wouldn't imagine, no, if they're laying it on the 15th of December, the end date is not going to be very much later than the 30th of January, like it is here. Given that they still have to come back and debate and scrutinise. So I'm just saying, I'm not saying if Scotland can do it, we can, but I sort of am, and it would appear that there is some slack. Not slack, but there is still some capacity. I suppose that we were having a discussion earlier and we're saying 23rd of November isn't day one. That's not the day you start your work. We know that you're
started already, yes.
Of course, exactly.
Yeah.
So can we make that formally a proposal that you can explore the possibility of, I think that's very ambitious. I would love that the budget document is laid before Christmas, like they're getting in Scotland, but for their Christmas list.
That's really the way Claire wants to spend her Christmas break.
But actually, that's kind of the point. Once we get back on the 9th, you are back on the merry-go-round, people do. That's nearly a month where people have their time to do their detailed work. As you rightly said, we can't process a 200-page research pack in the middle of the working week when you're here till 7 o'clock the night before and all that kind of stuff. And I wouldn't be spending Christmas Day doing it, but it would be very helpful to have that information in those weeks before. Obviously, just Christmas Eve and Boxing Day. Yeah. So can we
been involved in talks processes for the last few Christmases?
Can we propose that you at least explore that and come back to us?
I think it would be keen. We want to maximise the amount of time that the committee has to scrutinise. I suppose the Scottish system potentially is a little different because of theirs. The departmental structure is different. They effectively have one big department with particular limbs as opposed to separate structures. So that has been a barrier.
A unified executive now, though.
That has been a barrier before in terms of sort of just interdepartmental working, and I know it's something that they're looking at in terms of the programme for government. But I think it is worth, can you take that away, take a look at the process and see, we do want to maximise the time available.
We're certainly, I would like it done before Christmas too, if I possibly could.
Did you get that? No.
But it will be up to the executive to decide on the timescales for the agreement, but we will be progressing
it's
work.
Possible?
Yes.
It's possible. If you would like it done before Christmas, you think it's possible to do it before Christmas?
It depends.
Not beyond the realms.
It depends what comes out in the autumn statement. It depends on the outworking of Emer's, work with departments.
And it depends on the political will to do it.
Well, it depends on what decisions need to be taken, to be honest.
I think that these processes are always, there will always be, demand will always outstrip supply, and you will have to have that process even, I think, internally, with those 3 parties about where the pressures are and what the split should be. And I think it can be difficult if you're a minister in a particular department to actually say, well, look, I'm going to sacrifice my priorities within that because I believe that another department has a more legitimate pressure. But I know certainly that's where they want to get to with it. But I suppose it's how long does that process of brokerage actually take? Philip, you had a question?
Yes, Chair. I think it's just to carry on with what Claire was saying, because in essence, from what you were saying earlier on, the only unknown variable is the content of the autumn statement from the Chancellor on the 23rd. Everything else is actually within the control of the department and the executive. And actually, it should be easier than forecast because it's now only a 1-year budget. So it should be a shorter process.
1 year resource, Dell, and we're doing full 4 years capital.
I know, but in terms of, you've already said that the feedback you're getting so far from across the water is that resource changes may well be.
They said don't expect any additional. We're just never present. There's no change.
Well, I know today there was a report out saying that the Chancellor has an 80 billion black hole going forward. So yes, so there may be challenges around that, but that being the only, whatever the borne consequence of changes around that there, surely then you have a baseline budget, and then if whatever his outcome is, that has to then be factored in. If it's negative, then it does open up the conversation of who loses what if it's positive. Surely there's a number of projects that are earmarked for further investment. I would have thought it'd be, it's a complex process, I know, but not much more complex than it would normally be.
I wouldn't say more complex than it would normally be. The autumn statement is an added variable in that it's not as simple as just if we get extra money that we can nicely hand that out. our budget is not, even on the figures at the minute, there's a 4%, point something percent, can't remember the actuals, real terms decrease, so there are pressures across departments, and it will be how departments can cope with those pressures and prioritising within that. So it's by no means straightforward. The work's ongoing at the moment. We don't have a position as of yet, so it's, you know, there's work ongoing to identify those pressures in departments, and there'll be discussions and negotiations.
Thank you. I just, Chair, just following what maybe straying into the next section that you might want to talk about, which was the multi-year element in terms of once we get this put to bed, what comes next. And I said to our Raise colleagues earlier on there, I had a conversation with a school head earlier on today, and their big issue is going forward the third year of their 3-year budget, and obviously this year's halfway through. Next year's is now open for debate, but year 3, where I believe the vast majority of schools that are going to be moving into the red will go into the red significantly, that's unknown for them. So how do they manage that going forward in terms of their operational outworkings of their own individual budget? And that's just a school. I mean, that's writ large across the whole public sector, I'm sure. How do they manage that, and what's the plans for, I don't know, communicating with them to give them some comfort or some process to buy into in the weeks and months ahead?
Well, firstly, the 1-year resource budget is by no means ideal. Unfortunately, the autumn statement does pose a problem because we don't know, though I'm saying they said there's no additional resource dealt, we're talking about the 1 year. We don't know what the future years are going to bring to that. In terms of the follow-up to the budget process, we would like to start work immediately on, you know, the future year's budgets. The autumn statement will give some indication of the likely pressures facing the executive, and that can be communicated so as schools or other bodies have a feeling for what's coming down the line towards them. But we would then like to progress the following year, a multi-year budget at pace following that.
Have you any indicative timescales at this stage?
Not at this stage, no.
And I do think that brings us, you know, very neatly to sort of our last issue, which I want to raise now because I know that you're going to be extraordinarily busy over the next number of months in terms of the autumn statement and the implications of that. But, you know, the committee is really keen to get, you know, some best practice set down. You know, the committee, and certainly from my point of view, we do want to be helpful and useful both in terms of consultation with ideas coming forward and being able to assist the department by working with the other statutory committees to have a well-informed and well-consulted outcome, particularly in relation to the multi-year budget. So we are very keen that at a very early stage we are sitting down and planning forward for that. I know that there had been the Memorandum of Understanding previously, a draft, and there seemed to be some willingness both on the side of the committee and on the department to look at trying to establish a process. You know, there's no doubt that that kind of transparency around that process could give confidence to us to know about our forward work programme and our planning, but also then to the other statutory committees. So we would be keen to work with you at this early stage about looking at what that potentially, the indicative timescales, etc., what that looks like. But also, is this something that you would consider, perhaps if it's a memorandum of understanding or some sort of an agreed document or timetable that we can work on for the next year?
Well, as you said, we have been engaging with committee officials on that, and we are keen to continue that work. I suppose the difficulty we have is in tying down specific timescales, is because we are at the behest of the Treasury and their timescales, and things happen. And so we're also keen to make sure that whatever we come up with actually works, as opposed to having an agreement which is then immediately cast out because something else happens and the spending reviews late or the autumn statements late, and it immediately has to be thrown out the door because it's just not workable. So I think the challenge is in working together to come up with something that allows the proper engagement and sets out the ideals, but then is still manageable when things change. And
my sense is that that's absolutely possible. You know, the committee's not unreasonable in that regard. We do understand that, you know, sometimes these things do happen, but I think it is getting, you know, sort of ideally what would that look like, and then if something does happen, we can take a look again at that set down procedure and say, well, look, where's our flexibility? And it is, I think, about building flexibility into that as well, to take into account that sometimes these things happen. But I do think that the committee and the committee system here can be a very valuable resource, even for yourselves in the department, around capturing some of those ideas, particularly within the context of the programme for government as well, about where our priorities lie on all of this. I'm not sure. Presumably at this stage you don't really have any detail about what a potential process for the multi-year budget would look like. When are you likely to have that, or is there somebody that's given some consideration to that? I know everybody will be busy with the current process.
I would say it will be when this process concludes before we turn our minds to the next process. At this moment, to give an indication, you would imagine we would go back to previous year's processes, which would have a draft budget in September and a revised budget sort of November, December, but I couldn't say that's set in stone because we haven't actually considered or discussed with our Minister.
And given, and I understand that the Minister obviously has policy, this decision-making role in terms of this, but is he minded, because of the changing process around in-year monitoring, presumably there's going to be some changes around what had previously been discussed in the memorandum into what the new process looks like. Is he likely to produce something about this new process? Is this something that he's going to produce as a paper or guidance, something that we could have access to see what the new process looks like? And I do thank you. I think it's been very useful to hear your insight into that new process, but it's just with that new system in place, is the department going to be issuing that guidance to other departments, etc.? Is it going to be a public document?
Well, in terms of the process for the monitoring rounds, the monitoring guidelines, which are on our on the DOF intranet site, have been updated to reflect the new process. In terms of the budget, the process tends to be slightly different for every budget because it depends on the circumstances. Guidance goes out to departments in advance, usually of the budget process, and we'd be more than happy to share with the committee any of that guidance that goes out, but I'd say we haven't got to that stage yet or considered where that would be.
But you are content at this stage that we put together some of our ideas about what an ideal process would look like, taking into account absolutely some things may happen, and that we try to work with yourselves in the department to see if we can get an agreed process, preferably I suppose before the Easter break, to allow for it.
No, more than happy to say we have been engaged, and I'm more than happy to continue that. And we do welcome your input, and indeed for this budget process we would be grateful to take on any views of the committees before we start formulating the budget.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I don't think there's any other questions that we have syndicated, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any quick reflections about any of that before we canter on?
I remember certain parties arguing with great passion at one stage that we should actually go into a one-year budget process throughout the Assembly term. So that perhaps has changed.
Well, thank you, resident historian of the Assembly, for those of us
I like to share my knowledge.
I think in the system it's called a corporate memory,
It is,
and it's seen as a valuable thing.
Yeah.
See, I actually, as long as I've been here, I remember whenever I didn't have this brief, but I understood that we were critical of the fact that everybody else has a multi-year, every other institution in these islands has a multi-year budget process except this. When was this? And I'll go back. You can point me in the right direction.
No, it was only about 12 or 18 months ago, and there was sort of criticism that I think Scotland had introduced. Scotland had annual budgets, and the idea was that, well, to do that would be able to take into account sort of up-to-date positions and change, because traditionally Northern Ireland has always had a multi-year budget. Like the one-year budgets really come about just at the end of a multi-year budget period where there's been an extension or something exceptional happens.
There's some legal provision in Fresh Start, isn't there? I think there's some guidance in it about it having to map over with Westminster's. I can't remember to have to reverse of that. We weren't involved in doing it, but there is some guidance on the shape that the.
Did have to listen to Alex Atwood a lot during that process, so I think we're involved. You may not have signed up to it.
Yes, I was off having Christmas that year, so it's my turn to do the work this year. But so I understood that there are some guidelines that aren't compliant at the moment. But anyway, we are in a new dispensation now. But I thought it was useful, and some of the ways that they were. I mean, I'm just learning all this. Some of the ways that they expressed those concepts and processes, I thought were helpful. But the one thing I would take away from it is that they were reasonably optimistic that they could contract that process and at least give us some material to work with before Christmas recess.
Yeah, and I think the key thing here is to keep sort of just on top of that. We'll keep assessing and pushing to get that information as quickly as possible. You know, and I think it's probably worth as well writing to the Finance Minister to highlight that, you know, we're keen to maximise the period of time for scrutiny, and if that process can be contracted, then if at all possible, then it should be. So, Phil, did you have a comment there? No. Okay, well, we'll move swiftly on then to correspondence.
Sorry, Chair, before you move on, are members broadly content at least with the first part of this timetable for getting returns from committees in relation to the questions in the briefing paper? Obviously, the rest will change if the department comes back and says that they want.
But we are actually, that's what I want to clarify, we are asking them to revisit that timetable. Is that something that we're taking away from that discussion?
I think the point is that the first 4 points, the first couple of action points there is that the committee, Finance Board's request for information, statutory committees consider no harm is done by doing that now as quickly as possible. If we do get the change of sort of getting that, like really where the main changes are, would be potentially with that being brought forward a week or 2 weeks. So I don't think those first couple of points are affected by that. So we might as well, I think, get out of the traps as soon as possible, as quickly as possible, and write to committees in relation to that.
Well, the key question, Chair, for me is, even without any knowledge of what happens on the 23rd, as Joanne said, if they've got a 4.4% pressure on their Dell revenue budget for next year, then that's going to require difficult decisions even before the outcome of the autumn statement comes forward. So they're going to have to be working on that anyway. So it would be interesting to get departments' views. I suppose they're going to be working in the dark because they don't know what department's going to take the hit, essentially.
Although I do think, though, that in writing to our committee colleagues, you know, I think even those people on committees, that they should at this early stage be asking those questions of those respective departments around,
absolutely.
you know, taking into, and I suppose what I was trying to get at is, are they making assumptions for inflationary or other purposes at this point? So, for example, if you look at, and Jim will know this from the Department of Health, if you're making a presumption of a 4% or 2% inflationary increase in terms of staffing costs, you know, that becomes, you know, that's probably the same budget as the old DCAL had completely, you know, so these make up very, very significant pressures within education and health in particular because of the staff. So I suspect that those departments have got to be making some presumptions even at this stage, hoping for the best presumably, but also trying to make provision for what might be a very difficult position.
And the other difficulty is going to be, certainly I'm presuming on the back of yesterday's announcement re Bengoa, that there's going to be a funding injection in the new financial year for health to fund all the various proposals in the strategy. So if there's no net increase, in fact there's a net decrease, then those departments that are not health are going to get a double hit, not only from, well, triple hit, one on budget reduction, two on inflation, as my understanding is they're currently working on 2%. And
yeah, because there has been an inflationary increase.
Well, even things on currency, for example, I know, back to the example of schools who are spending significant thousands of pounds on heating oil, working on a 2% inflationary increase for the next 2 to 3 years. It's unlikely to be the case. Now, it's not massive money, but it could end up being the guts of £1,000 increase to a medium-sized school. And then, of course, you have the hit on health, where people are going to have to give up budget to fund the increase in health funding. So there's a triple whammy there for a lot of departments, and as you said, Chair, they're going to have to start asking and thinking about some awkward questions in advance of even knowing what the figures are going to be.
Well, that's why, look, there's clearly been very wide support for the Health Minister's sort of, you know, vision document. But if you look at the, you know, the detail of that, and you're looking at the timescales, there are actions which are to take place, you know, really even starting from next month. So one suspects that there has to be some sort of a financial implication of that into the next financial year. But that's why I suppose, and I raised this issue earlier about, I suppose, those difficult conversations that need to happen about that double hit. You know, that where, you know, there are pressures by the first two, the inflationary and the overall budget position being contracted anyway. That, you know, to have that conversation with departments about, well, look, what are you going to give up? Because if there's a commitment to invest in health, something has to give elsewhere. So I suppose my fear a little bit, Claire, is that that process may not just be a 1 or 2 or day process, that there'll be a series of bilaterals and then there'll be a series of negotiations around that and there'll be a collective position. But if it can be contracted, look, let's ask for that. But it just may not be as simple as...
I'm not saying it is, I'm not saying it's ready to go, but I'm saying it is possible. I wasn't getting the sense that they're telling us that it was impossible. And as I say, if you look at Scotland's timeline, it's just, I'm not saying we will rewrite it, but if we're here and people aren't providing enough alternative, having more than a few days to look at it would facilitate at least not just seeing, because all you can really in that time look at the different bulges and contractions. You can't look at anything more detailed than that. But if you had a month...
And I suppose it's also worth, like us as a committee, considering that from the Department of Finance point of view, are there any particular priority issues that we feel that, should be funded within there that we're going to put forward as ideas? Or I suppose it is difficult. Some of those issues don't sound perhaps as important, and you look in the context of the pressures in health and education, etc. But I suppose it being proactive with that as well would be useful. Okay, so moving swiftly on then to correspondence, I would refer members to pages 125 to 158 of the main pack. The clerk will run through the various pieces of correspondence.
Thank you, Chair. The first item on page 127 is written response on the implementation of each of the recommendations in the former committee's report on sickness absence. It's just suggested that they receive an oral briefing on that from the department and an update on any actions taken to address underperformance.
And again, I thought that was quite an interesting piece of correspondence, particularly looking at the much higher rate of female sickness compared to male,
What's it?
Considerably higher percentage of females.
Oh, so sorry, I didn't hear what the word was.
In the system, taking on average much more time off, and I think that might be worth something for this committee to consider around. Some of that is, of course, about family pressures, and we know that if a child is sick, it almost invariably is the mum that goes to and has to take off work or takes off work to look after that child. There perhaps is something from a Department of Finance point of view, with that responsibility for personnel. Could there be more being done to support women in the workplace in terms of flexible work and in terms of pregnancy and other related issues, but also those caring duties? So I just thought it was interesting that. I think that's one issue we could pick up. Sorry, Jim.
I was going to say, on that issue, in fairness to the public sector, they probably have the most generous policies of any employer. But the one interesting issue that jumped out at me in the most recent report was the complete correlation between number of absence days and grade. And I know when you get into senior grades, maybe there's more flexibility there for people to manage their time accordingly. But I thought it was bizarre that if you exclude prison officers, the slope just went down from AO right down to senior civil service. So I don't know what the justification on that is, but again, it's a question that's worth pondering.
But you're also looking at, and sorry not to open up too much of a discussion around this, but you are looking at, for example, a lot of frontline staff being on lower grades within the likes of social security offices. You're getting perhaps a bit more of a stressful situation then on that sort of front line of customer service within those offices. But I think there's also, like somebody was saying to me about maybe some of the practices which are counterintuitive to what we're trying to achieve. So, for example, an alert will go up if you take X amount of leave periods over the course of a year. But in each leave period, you're allowed to have, up to so many days. So if you're a person working at a relatively low level in an office, there's no benefit to you necessarily of coming back. You could take 3 one-day absences, no system alert. You could take 3 5-day absences, no alert. But if you are unfortunate enough to take 4 one-days, then suddenly you're flagged in the system. So the person with 4 days is actually getting alerting system. The person with the 15 days and their 3 periods of absence is not. So I think there's a bit of a counter. Sometimes some of the practices designed to tackle these issues perhaps are working against us, because I do suspect that people say, well, I'll just take the extra day.
Well, Bradford encourages us to take more time off. If you have any doubt at all, if you've got the flu, don't struggle back, because if you do and you have to take another couple of days off, you'll be punished.
Yeah.
You're better taking a fortnight off and getting done with it.
So I think there's some practices you can look at to say, but those are the two particular, taking the prison service, because I think there is a very particular problem there. But taking those two issues of very low-grade staff and the high absences, and then the women issue, I think would be worth us as a committee looking at those two issues, saying what practices could be put in place to actually improve that.
Yeah, I think they're. I mean, I think the one you raised.
No.
If I was sick, I'm not never sick. But
So if members are content, then receive an oral briefing on that.
Yeah.
yeah, definitely.
The next thing is a response from the department regarding defamation. The committee asked if the minister would be supportive of a private member's bill on this, and the question that was asked wasn't answered, so it's just a suggestion to go back and ask for an answer to the question that was asked. The third thing is the Committee for the Executive Office Programme for Government Engagement with Stakeholders. So it's a suggestion to identify that the engagement that the Department plans to take with stakeholders and to respond to the Committee for the Executive Office on that. The next thing is Invest in I. It's an invitation from Invest in I to the Chair and Deputy Chair to lunch with the President of Colombia. So we'll follow up with the Chair and Deputy Chair to see if you're available to attend that if members are in agreement. In the Committee for the Executive Office
In
together.
Colombia?
In Colombia.
It's in Colombia. It's in Belfast.
Together building a united community strategy, so it's to note and ask the department for its assessment of the actions it is taking in respect of the strategy, and then all other items of correspondence are to note. So if members are content with the suggested approach.
Yeah. Okay. So just moving on into forward work programme. The draft forward work programme is page 160, 162 of the main pack. The officials have advised that the scheduled date of the 9th of November is within the period of ongoing Executive Office consideration consultation on the programme for government. So NISRA have asked, can we put off their briefing session until, I guess, early next year? January, February 2017, just so they're better informed, I think, around the programme for government and what it might look like. Everybody content for that? Okay, so we'll reschedule that. Any other issues coming up from that forward work programme? I would be quite keen to, we'd suggested last week about us getting out and meeting some people. Yeah, no, we're not going to go. So I would be quite keen actually that we do, and I know that there's quite a bit on at the minute, and I accept that, but I just think as part of our rates work programme, I'd be quite keen to even for us to get out maybe before Christmas, to get out at least have maybe a couple of sessions with some of our key stakeholders.
Sure, can I come in on that? The Assembly and Business Trust has been in touch with the committee office in relation to that, and they would be keen to do something together if members are minded to take that approach to it. In relation to external events, the committee staff could liaise with them to see if something can be organised in that.
I think we have identified sort of the small business. I think it would be good to go out and speak to some business associations in towns that have been struggling, just to hear their issues and to see what their issues are. I've been in contact in the interim with the Northern Ireland Retail Association, so they represent a big Northern Ireland Retail Consortium.
Yes, sir. They did come back to the committee office on that, so that'll be in package for the next meeting.
Yeah, so they represent sort of large retail, so it might be an easier way, because we talked about how do we cover all of our bases, but they do cover the likes of B&Q and Tesco, I think Asda, a number of the business, the big. So even they perhaps could just facilitate a number of their members to come if we went out and took a look at a situation. Like one of the things actually, John, it was specifically to use an example of Portadown, where you clearly you've got the small retailer stress, you've got the high street stress, small business stress. But you've also got that situation about, if you look at the likes of the Meadow Centre around the city centre, that actually the large retailer, which is Tesco's there, if they were to move out of there, that would have an even greater impact. So I think sometimes we don't necessarily fully consider the role of the big retailer in actually supporting struggling high streets as well. So it might be good just to get that perspective from them as well, Katrina.
And we can always consider Newry, border town, and disproportionate
I think
impact.
with the weakness of the pound is Newry not booming. Like,
Yeah,
I do
but
remember
it's-
the days
but
when you
it's
used to queue
boom-
to get into Newry.
It's boom and bust, you know. One minute it's Dundalk, the next minute it's Newry, so it doesn't actually do anyone any good. So it might be interesting just to throw my tuppence worth in there.
Well, why don't members make some suggestions about, like, all of these towns are going to have like a small traders association or traders. They're going to have some large retailer, you know, so I think we can do, my suggestion would be that we go and we try to do maybe 2 sessions on two of the, you know, 2 of the stakeholders, as opposed to trying to do a day out on each of them, because that would be quite difficult to schedule all of that in. But perhaps the members want to make some suggestions about where we need to go, and then we'll get into a negotiation about which one we should go out to.
Chair, we can issue an email to members to respond to in relation to that.
Any other issues then on the forward work programme, everybody? Okay. Just under any other business, just to reference before we go into the closed session in terms of the legal advice, but you know, next week is a recess week for the Assembly, but I'm assuming that most members are not actually in recess, but just in your constituency office, etc. So I presume members will be available, but the clerk will treat this as a normal recess week in terms of the taking receipt of freedom of information requests. But I think, as we discussed previously, obviously anything particularly controversial, you know, just have that awareness to ensure that members then have the opportunity. It's only a week, so it's, I can't think anything devastating will happen over that period. So the date, time and place of the next meeting is Wednesday, 9th of November 2016, room 29, here at 2 p.m. So that's all of the agenda items in open session. So I just want then to seek the agreement of the committee to move into closed session.
Yes.
Yeah? Okay.
Room 29.